I almost didn't go that day. I know that sounds like a strange way to open a story, but it's the truth. I'd been in London for 4 days already, 4 days of rain, of cold coffee, of my feet aching inside shoes that were not built for cobblestones. My original plan had been to visit Buckingham Palace on Tuesday, get my photos, buy an overpriced tin of shortbread with the Queen's face on it, and move on. Simple tourist stuff. But Tuesday came and the sky cracked open like it had a personal grudge against me, so I pushed it to Wednesday. Wednesday I got lost on the tube and ended up in Canary Wharf for 3 hours talking to a retired electrician named Bernard who had strong opinions about modern football. Thursday, I told myself, was the day. No more excuses. No more delays. So Thursday it was. I left my hotel just after 9 in the morning. The kind of London morning that almost makes you forget all the grey ones. The sky was doing this pale gold thing, not quite sunny but trying, you know? Like the city was making an effort. The air had that cool cleanness to it that you only get after it's rained the night before, when everything smells like wet stone and cut grass from the parks. I walked from Victoria Station. Didn't want to rush it. Pulled my jacket collar up, had my camera bag over one shoulder, and just walked. Past the coffee shops waking up, past the red buses that somehow still feel theatrical even when you've seen 10 of them, past the pigeons doing their dignified waddle across the pavement like they own the whole city. Which, honestly, they probably do. By the time I turned onto the mall, I could already see the palace sitting at the end of it like a painting someone decided to make real. There's something that happens in your chest when you see it for the first time or even the second or third time, I imagine. It doesn't matter how many photographs you've seen. The actual thing hits differently. It's the weight of it. The stillness of it. The way it just sits there, completely unbothered, while the whole city rushes around in every direction. The crowds were already building. It was maybe 9:30 by then, and the tourists were out in full force, families with pushchairs, school groups in matching yellow vests, couples taking selfies, solo visitors like me with their cameras half raised like they're not quite sure if they're allowed to photograph this much history. There's a certain energy around the palace gates that's hard to describe. It's not reverent, exactly. It's more like collective awe mixed with a bit of nerves. Everyone's kind of performing their excitement, but underneath it, most people are genuinely moved. I found myself a spot near the front of the railings, slightly to the left of center, where I'd read you get a good angle on the guardsmen. I'd done my homework. I knew the changing of the guard wasn't scheduled until 11, so I had time. I set up my camera, adjusted the strap, and just let myself stand there for a while, watching. The guards were already posted at their positions. 2 of them in front of the main gates, straight as lampposts, faces completely unreadable beneath those extraordinary bearskin hats. I've always found those hats slightly absurd, in the most magnificent way possible. They add about 2 feet to a man's height. They turn a human being into a symbol. That's the point, I suppose. The guard isn't meant to look like a person you could walk up to and borrow a lighter from. He's meant to look like something ancient and permanent, like part of the architecture. I watched the nearest one for a while. His eyes were fixed somewhere in the middle distance, that trained stare that goes right through you without seeing you. His jaw was set. Not tense, just still. There's a difference. Tension is effort. This was something deeper, more practiced. He'd been doing this long enough that the stillness had become natural. People were doing the usual things. A pair of teenage boys, American, from their accents, wearing matching basketball jerseys that felt slightly surreal against the backdrop of Georgian limestone, were pulling faces at the guard, getting way too close, daring each other to make him flinch. They weren't being cruel, exactly. Just young. Just thoughtless in the way teenagers can be. The guard didn't move a millimeter. Not even his eyes shifted. I'd seen this game played before, and, I'll tell you, there's something quietly heroic about those guards in those moments. Because ignoring someone who's actively trying to provoke you requires more self-control than most people will ever have to exercise in their entire lives. It's not passive. It's active, constant, deliberate restraint. Every second is a choice. The mother of one of the boys grabbed his arm and pulled him back, mouthing an apology in the direction of the guard, even though the guard gave no indication he'd registered the boy's existence at all. I smiled at that and went back to adjusting my camera settings. And that's when I noticed the car. It came through the side entrance, the one to the right, partly obscured by the outer building, the one that the tour guides sometimes mention as the working entrance rather than the ceremonial one. A dark vehicle, one of those Range Rovers with tinted windows that you see ferrying important people around London like a floating bubble of privacy. It moved slowly, carefully, the way vehicles always move inside palace grounds. It stopped. And then, the door opened. I wasn't the only one who looked. There were maybe 40 or 50 people along the railings at that point, and I'd say at least half of them turned at the sound of the car door. Human instinct. You hear something out of the ordinary and your eyes go toward it without asking your brain's permission. Two figures stepped out. The first was an adult, a woman, slim, in a navy coat, her hair half tucked into the collar. She moved with the kind of purposeful ease that people who are used to being looked at develop over years. No hesitation. No self-consciousness. Just a smooth, unhurried walk toward the side entrance of the palace. But it was the second figure who made the crowd go quiet. A boy. Maybe 9 or 10 years old, though he had the kind of composed bearing that sometimes made him seem older in photographs. He was wearing a simple gray jacket, not royal regalia, not ceremonial dress, just a gray jacket and dark trousers, like any kid dressed neatly for a school visit or a family occasion. Dark blonde hair. Neat. He stepped out of the car with a small rucksack over one shoulder and stood for a moment, squinting slightly in the pale morning light. And even from where I was standing across the forecourt, behind the railings, there was something about the way he held himself that made you look. Not arrogance. Not performance. Just a kind of quiet presence that's hard to explain. Like he was comfortable in his own skin in a way that most adults never quite manage. A murmur went through the crowd near me. I heard someone whisper his name. I heard a woman grab her husband's arm. I heard the click-click-click of about 15 cameras going off at once. Because it was Prince George. Now, I want to be careful here, because I know how these things can get overblown. I know people see a royal family member and, suddenly, everything becomes the most extraordinary thing that's ever happened. I'm not that person. I'm genuinely not. But I'm also someone who was standing there, in that specific moment, and what happened next genuinely surprised me. Not because it was dramatic or dangerous or unprecedented. But because it was small. And human. And completely unexpected. And those are sometimes the moments that stick with you the longest. He'd started walking toward the palace entrance. His minder, a woman walking a couple of paces to his left and, slightly behind, had her attention split between him and something on a small device in her hand. The adult who'd emerged first from the car had already gone inside. There was a brief pause as someone held a door. George, and I'm going to call him George because that's his name and this is a story, not a press release, slowed slightly as he passed the posted guard. The guard was standing at the inner position, closer to the palace itself rather than the outer gates. I hadn't been watching him specifically, I'd been watching the car, then George. But, in the moment George slowed, my eyes followed him, and so they landed, almost accidentally, on the guard at the same time. The guard was everything you'd expect. Bearskin hat. Red tunic. White gloves. Rifle at his side. Chin level. Eyes forward. Immovable. George stopped walking. Just for a second. Just briefly enough that his minder took one extra step before she registered it and paused too, half turning with a look that was professional and slightly questioning at the same time. And George, this 9-year-old boy who had grown up in this building, who had walked past guards like this one probably thousands of times in his life, who had never known a day without them, George looked at the guard. Really looked. Not the way tourists look, with that cocktail of fascination and slight mockery. Not the way officials look, which is to say not at all. He looked the way you look at someone when you actually see them. And then, he did something. Something small. Something that nobody near me seemed to immediately understand, because there was this beat of silence, this pause of collective confusion, before the murmurs started again, but different this time. Quieter. More uncertain. George gave the guard a nod. Not a wave. Not a smile. Not the kind of performative, crowd-playing gesture that you might see from a royal on a walkabout, shaking hands down a line of well-wishers. Just a nod. Brief. Deliberate. Chin dropping the smallest fraction, eyes making proper contact for just a moment before he looked away and resumed walking. It lasted maybe 1 second. 1 single second. But, in that 1 second, everything changed. Because the guard, the perfectly still, perfectly composed, institutionally immovable guard, nodded back to, "I need to stop here and explain something about royal guards, because I think it matters for you to understand why that nod hit the way it did. These men, and they are overwhelmingly men, though the regiment has seen female officers too, are not statues. Obviously. Everyone knows that, on some level. They're human beings in uniform. But, the protocol of their duty is built around the erasure of that humanity, at least in the public-facing performance of it. When you are posted at Buckingham Palace, you are not James or Thomas or Kieran. You are the guard. You are the institution. You are continuity and tradition made flesh. The rules around what a guard can and cannot do while posted are strict in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. They cannot speak to members of the public. They cannot engage with provocations. They cannot show emotion, discomfort, or personality. When they need to move, when they march, when they turn, they do it in a precise, choreographed sequence that has been rehearsed until the individual self has been subordinated entirely to the collective movement. And, they absolutely, under normal circumstances, do not make eye contact with individuals in a crowd. That's not a written rule I can quote you chapter and verse. But, anyone who's watched them long enough understands it implicitly. The stare they maintain is deliberately unfocused. It passes over the crowd rather than entering it. Because to make eye contact with a specific person is to acknowledge that person as an individual, and that acknowledgement, however brief, breaks the illusion of the symbol. So when the guard nodded back at George, a distinct, deliberate, individuated response to a specific person, it broke a kind of invisible boundary. Not a rule. Not protocol. Something softer than that. Something more human. And the crowd felt it before they understood it. I watched it happen in real time, this ripple of reaction moving through the people at the railings. The woman to my left, she'd been photographing everything with the focused intensity of someone who planned to document every second of this holiday, lowered her camera. Not intentionally. It just dropped, the way your hands drop when your brain suddenly needs all its resources elsewhere. She was staring at the space where George had been standing, then at the guard, then back again. Did he just? She started, and then didn't finish. The man beside her, who I assumed was her husband, said, "I think so." "Guards don't do that," she said. "I know." A pause. "Did you get it?" He looked at his camera. "I don't know. Maybe." That exchange has stayed with me. Did you get it? The instinct not to process what you witnessed, not to let it settle, but to check whether you captured it. Whether you have proof. Whether the moment exists somewhere outside your own memory. I understand that instinct. I feel it myself, with cameras and notebooks. But there's also something a little sad about it, isn't there? The scramble to document the thing while the thing is still happening, while the feeling of it is still alive in your chest. I hadn't gotten it, for what it's worth. I'd been watching, not shooting. My camera was still at my side. But I saw it. I know what I saw. George had gone inside by now. The door had closed behind him with that firm, cushioned finality that expensive, well-maintained doors have. His minder had followed, and the forecourt had returned to its previous configuration, the cars, the open space, the distant sounds of the city, the tourists at the railings. The guard had returned to his previous position. Or, more accurately, he had never left it. His body hadn't moved. He was still standing at the same point, in the same posture, with the same level gaze. If you'd arrived at the railings 30 seconds after it happened, you would have seen nothing unusual. Just a guard, doing his job, looking at nothing in particular. But the people who'd witnessed it were different now. I could feel it in the way the crowd at the railings had shifted, not physically, but in its quality. The energy had changed. People were speaking more quietly. Some weren't speaking at all. There was a woman 3 people down from me who was just standing there with her hand over her mouth, and I couldn't tell if she was about to cry or if she was just overwhelmed, or both. I've thought about why it hit people so hard. I've had months to think about it now, and I still don't have a clean answer. Part of it was the surprise, the sheer unexpectedness of seeing a guard break with his performance, even in such a tiny way. Part of it was the contrast, this globally recognized, historically significant institution of royal protection, and this small boy, and the moment of recognition between them. Part of it, I think, was something about hierarchy. Or the absence of it, briefly. The nod George gave was not the nod of a future king to one of his soldiers. It was, or it felt like, the nod of one person to another. I see you. I know you're there. And the guard's response said the same thing back. That exchange, stripped of all the pomp and weight and ceremony, was just 2 people acknowledging each other's humanity. And apparently that's rare enough, even in everyday life, that when it happens in front of a crowd, people don't quite know what to do with themselves. Someone near me had already pulled out their phone and was describing it in a text message, their thumbs moving fast. I caught fragments, "You won't believe," and "the guard actually," and "so random but kind of beautiful." Kind of beautiful. Yeah. That's close. There was a shift in the crowd after that, something I noticed gradually over the next 20 minutes or so. People were being different at the railings. The teenage boys who'd been pulling faces at the guards had gone quiet. The couple who'd been taking jokey, posed photos, tongues out, mock-stern expressions mimicking the guards had put their phone down and were just looking. Even the pigeons seemed to have found other business to attend to. A woman beside me, Australian accent, grey walking shoes, the kind of practical sun hat that says "I am here to actually see things, not to be seen," turned to me after a few minutes and said, "Did you see that? With the boy?" "I did," I said. She nodded slowly. "My husband thinks I imagined it." "You didn't." "That's what I said." She looked back at the guard. 20 years I'd been meaning to come here. 20 years. You'd think you'd be prepared for it. But you're never really prepared for it, are you? I asked her what she meant. "For the moment when it suddenly feels real," she said. I didn't have anything to add to that, so I just stood there with her for a moment, both of us looking at the guard, who was once again perfectly still, perfectly composed, giving away absolutely nothing. I went and found a bench on the outer edge of the forecourt area, closer to the memorial, and I sat down and just tried to think. I'd come here for photographs. I was going to get my photos, have my experience, tick my box, and move on to the next thing on the itinerary. I'd budgeted maybe an hour and a half. That had been the plan. It was now past 11. I'd been here for nearly 2 hours and I hadn't taken a single photograph worth keeping. I'd been too busy watching. My thoughts kept circling back to the guard. Not George. George was 9 years old and did a nice thing, and that speaks well of him and of whoever is raising him to see the people around him rather than through them. That's its own kind of story. But George disappeared through a door and went inside a palace and back to his life. The guard stayed. The guard was still standing there. Still in the cold. Still in that immovable posture, that trained stillness, those white gloves and that extraordinary hat. Still watching the middle distance. And somewhere inside all of that, inside all the uniform and the training and the protocol and the performance, was the man who'd nodded back. The man who, for 1 second, had let himself respond. Had let himself be seen. I found myself wondering about him. What was his name? Where was he from? What did he think about during those long hours of standing? Did he have a family? Did he go home after a shift and watch football and eat leftover pasta and Bicker about what to watch on television, the way everyone does? Did he ever talk about his job at parties, not in a boasting way, just in the conversational way, and did people's eyes go wide, the way they always do, when he said he was a household division guardsman stationed at Buckingham Palace? Did he tell them about the time a small boy nodded at him, and he nodded back? I thought he probably didn't. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because meaning and story are different things. He might carry that moment without ever converting it into language. It might just be part of him now, a small, private thing that happened on a Thursday morning in autumn, one thread in the fabric of a career built on days that look identical from the outside. The changing of the guard happened at 11. I watched it. It is, as advertised, an impressive thing. The precision of it. The music, which is played by the regimental band with a commitment that is both earnest and slightly thrilling. The boots striking the forecourt in perfect unison. The ceremony of the handover, the almost ritualistic formality of one guard passing duty to another, which carries all this quiet, serious weight, like watching a flame passed from one candle to the next in a darkened church. The crowd loved it. People climbed the railings slightly. Phones went up. Children were hoisted onto shoulders. Someone started clapping, which other people joined in with, though the guards made no acknowledgement of the applause whatsoever, which is exactly right and also a little funny. I loved it too. More than I expected to, honestly. More than I'd have admitted before I came. But the moment I kept returning to wasn't the changing of the guard. It wasn't the music or the precision or the ceremony. It was 1 second earlier that morning. A boy. A nod. A nod back. And a crowd of strangers standing in the autumn light, changed by something they weren't sure they'd actually witnessed, trying to figure out what to do with a feeling they hadn't planned to have today. There was one more thing that happened before I left. I want to include it because it felt like a kind of coda to the whole experience, the moment that made me realize this was a story worth telling. I was making my way back toward the gate, camera bag over my shoulder, when I passed an older man standing apart from the main crowd. He was in his 70s, maybe neat white hair, a good winter coat, the careful bearing of a man who has spent his life being precise about things. He was looking at the guard. Not filming. Not photographing. Just looking. I paused near him because there was something in his expression that made me slow down. He wasn't teary, exactly. But there was something going on in his face that you don't see very often. A kind of recognition. Like he was seeing something he'd forgotten he knew. I don't know what made me speak. I'm not usually the person who speaks to strangers. But, I said, were you here earlier? When the boy came through? He looked at me. His eyes were very clear and blue. Yes, he said. I was. Did you see it? The nod? He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, my son is a guardsman. Different regiment. Colchester, not London. He paused. People ask him at Christmas, don't the tourists bother you? Standing there while people make fools of themselves? A small exhale, something between a laugh and a breath. He always says the same thing. He says, you wait for the ones who see you. They're rare, but you wait for them. He looked back at the guard. I think that boy sees people, he said quietly. That's not nothing. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to say. No, I agreed. It's not nothing at all. We stood in silence for a few seconds, two strangers looking at the same guard, before he gave me a small nod, just like the one, a sort of quiet acknowledgement, and walked away. And, I thought, there it is again. The same gesture. Moving through the morning like a quiet ripple in water. One person seeing another. One person choosing to say so. It cost nothing. It meant everything. I didn't write about that morning for a long time. Not because I wanted to protect it, though there was some of that, I'll admit. Certain moments feel like they belong to you for a while before they're ready to be shared. Like they need time to settle, the way sediment settles in water, before you can see clearly what's actually at the bottom. Mostly, though, I didn't write about it because I wasn't sure I could do it justice. And that's a paralyzing feeling for someone who writes. When something matters to you, the gap between what you experienced and what the words can carry starts to feel enormous. You sit down and you type out the basics. I was at Buckingham Palace and I saw Prince George nod at a guard and the guard nodded back, and even as you read it back you can hear how flat it sounds. How insufficient. It happened. Here is what happened. The end. Except it wasn't the end. Not for me, anyway. I've traveled a fair amount over the years. Not in an exotic or adventurous way. I'm not jumping out of planes or sailing small boats across large oceans. Just ordinary travel. Cities, mostly. The kind where you walk until your feet hurt and then you find a place to sit and you watch people for a while, and gradually the city starts to feel like something more than a backdrop. What I've noticed, doing this kind of travel, is that the things you remember are almost never the things you plan to remember. You plan to remember the cathedral. You plan to remember the museum, the famous painting, the architectural marvel you read about in 3 different guidebooks. You stand in front of these things with the full weight of your expectation pressing down on them, and sometimes they deliver, genuinely. Sometimes a famous thing is famous because it deserves to be, and it earns the feeling you were hoping for. But the things that stay, the images and moments that surface unbidden years later, while you're doing something mundane like making coffee or waiting for a bus, those are almost always the unplanned things. The side street things. The accidental things. A stray cat sitting on a warm step in Lisbon, turning its face toward the sun. An old man teaching his granddaughter to play chess at a table outside a bar in Barcelona, taking enormous patient care with each move. A busker in Edinburgh playing something slow and minarchy in the rain, his case open, a pound or two inside it, not looking at the people passing, just playing, for its own sake, into the wet air. Now, I suppose, a boy. A guard. A nod. I looked up the regiment when I got home. Read about the Household Division, which is the collective name for the various regiments that perform ceremonial and active military duties for the Crown. I read about the training. About what it actually takes to stand at a post for 2 hours without moving, without responding, without letting the weather or the noise or the tourists or the boredom or the exhaustion register on your face. It's harder than it sounds, which you probably already know on some level, even if you've never thought about it specifically. Soldiers have spoken about the mental strategies they use during posting, the counting, the breathing, the way you learn to occupy your mind while your body remains absolutely still. It's a form of active meditation, almost. You're not blank. You're intensely present. You're managing a constant stream of sensation and thought and redirecting it inward, away from your face, away from your hands, away from anything the public can see. And you do this every shift. Day after day. In summer heat and winter cold. When tourists treat you like a prop and when children scream in your face and when the rain comes sideways and gets into the gap between your collar and your neck and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You do this because you chose it. Because you raised your hand and said this is the life I want. Because there's something in the discipline itself, something in the daily demand for that level of self-mastery that means something to you. Even if you can't fully explain it to the people at Christmas who ask if tourists bother you. You wait for the ones who see you. I thought about that line a lot, in the weeks after London. The man in the good coat had told me his son said that. You wait for the ones who see you. Because they do come. Not often. Not reliably. But they come. I called my mother about a week after I got back. Nothing unusual about that, I call her most weeks. We talked about the usual things, her garden, my work, whether I was eating properly. She always asks this, and I always say yes, and we both know I'm being optimistic at best. I don't know why I told her about the palace. I hadn't told anyone else yet. But there we were, 20 minutes into an otherwise ordinary phone call, and I said, something happened in London that I keep thinking about. And I told her the whole thing. George, the car, the nod back. The woman who lowered her camera. The man with the blue eyes and the sun in Colchester. The stillness of the guard afterward, as if nothing had happened at all. My mother was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then, she said, "You know what that reminds me of?" I said I didn't. "Your grandfather," she said. "When you were very small. He worked at the factory for 30 years. 30 years in the same place. And the thing he always said was that the managers came and went, but the ones who lasted, the ones who built something real, were the ones who knew the men's names." I hadn't thought about my grandfather in months. He died when I was 11. I don't have many clear memories of him: a smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco, a very firm handshake, a laugh that was loud and sudden and surprised you every time. "The ones who knew the men's names," I repeated. "Not because it was policy," my mother said. "Not because someone told them to. Just because they noticed. Just because they looked." She paused. "That boy looked." "He did," I said. Here's what I think happened that morning, and I want to be clear that this is just my interpretation. I'm one person who was standing at a railing with a camera bag and an empty morning. I'm not a royal biographer. I'm not a military historian. I'm just someone who was there. I think Prince George has grown up inside one of the most watched, most scrutinized, most performed lives in the modern world. Every public appearance logged and analyzed. Every expression studied. Every haircut noted. He has never known a version of the world in which he is ordinary. He probably never will. And, yet, someone, his parents, his grandparents, his teachers, someone in his life has apparently spent some care trying to raise him to see the ordinary in others. To not let the extraordinariness of his own position blind him to the humanness of the people around him. The cooks and the security staff and the drivers and the guardsmen. The people who make the machinery of his life run, silently and invisibly, because that's the job. The nod wasn't royal condescension dressed up as warmth. I've seen that. I know what that looks like, that tight smile and the eyes that are already on the next person in the line. This wasn't that. This was a boy pausing mid-step because he had, in that moment, actually registered a specific human being. And he'd communicated it. Quietly, privately, in the one small way that was available to him without making a scene or disrupting protocol or embarrassing anyone. And the guard, whose job requires him to erase his own individuality as completely as possible, whose professionalism is measured partly by how thoroughly he can disappear into the uniform, the guard chose, in that same moment, to receive it. To allow himself to be seen seeing. To break the surface of the performance, just for a second, and say, "Yes. I'm here. I see you seeing me." It was a loop. A tiny, closed, human loop. And, somehow 40 strangers at a railing felt it. A few months later I was back in London. Different trip, different reasons, a work thing, nothing exciting. I had half a day free on the Saturday, and I thought, I'll go back. I told myself I didn't have any specific expectation. I told myself I was just going for the walk, for the fresh air, for the geometry of the palace against a winter sky. And those things were all true. But there was something else underneath them, something I didn't fully admit to myself until I was standing at the railings again, looking at the posted guard. I didn't expect it to happen again. Whatever it was that happened, that specific conjunction of boy and guard and moment and crowd, that's not something you can reproduce. Life doesn't offer reruns of its quietly significant scenes. But I stood there for a while. Longer than I needed to. Just looking. The guard that day was a different man. Taller. Different build. Different face, what I could see of it. But the same posture. The same stillness. The same trained, inward gaze passing over the crowd without landing on any of it. The tourists around me were doing the usual things. A couple of kids tried the face-pulling routine. A woman elbowed her way to the front for a photograph. A guide was explaining something in Japanese to a group of 20 who were listening with extraordinary attention, notebooks out. And I thought, he's in there. Somewhere in there, behind the uniform and the training and the protocol, there's a man who has a name and a family and a life and opinions about things. There's a man who is waiting, in his own way, not consciously, not dramatically, not with any specific hope, but waiting, the way you wait for small good things when you've been doing a hard job long enough to know they come sometimes. Waiting for the ones who see him. I stood there for a long time. And then, because I am not a 9-year-old prince and I am not a person with any particular claim to the guard's attention, and because the moment for that specific kind of gesture had long since passed, I turned up my collar against the cold, pulled my bag up on my shoulder, and walked away. But I looked at him before I left. Really looked. The way you look at someone when you see them. I don't know if he noticed. He gave no sign. His gaze remained in the middle distance, that extraordinary trained focus, seeing everything and nothing at once. But I like to think that somewhere inside the stillness, something registered. Some small, wordless acknowledgement that another person had, briefly, made the choice to see. It costs nothing. And, on a cold morning in London, standing at iron railings with a camera you've forgotten to use and a chest full of something you can't quite name, it means more than you can say. I've told this story to a handful of people since. Not many. 5, maybe 6. My mother was the first. A friend over dinner who I knew would get it. A colleague on a long flight who asked me about travel and what I'd seen lately that had actually moved me. Every time I tell it, I get to the nod, the small, quiet, civilian nod from a boy who should, by all rights, have simply walked past, and I watch the person I'm telling it to go still. Not the dramatic stillness of shock. More the stillness of recognition. The stillness that happens when something small and true touches something small and true inside you. And, every time, the response is some version of the same thing. That's it? That's the story? A nod? Yes. A nod. But the other person nodded back. And 40 strangers at a railing changed. And a man in a good coat told me his son waits for those moments. And a woman lowered her camera at exactly the wrong time and asked whether her husband had gotten it, and they both stood in the cold trying to hold on to something that had already become a memory. And I'm still thinking about it, months later, on an ordinary Tuesday, making coffee, and that guard is still standing there in my mind perfectly still, giving nothing away except for that 1 second when he did. The most human things are almost always the smallest ones. You could walk past them 100 times and never notice. And then, one morning, in a city that isn't yours, at a railing you almost didn't bother standing at, you look up at exactly the right moment. And a boy nods at a soldier. And the soldier nods back. And something shifts in the air, in the crowd, in you quietly, permanently, without anyone raising a hand or saying a word. That's it. That's the whole story. And I think about it still.